Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Today we have a great show. It's going to be very fantasy football heavy, especially concerning last night's game between the Atlanta Falcons and the Philadelphia Eagles. A crazy contest, a game-winning touchdown drive, a lot to recap. But we also have to look at the waiver wire as well. I want to do a deep dive there because of all the injuries stockpiling up. You might want to turn to the waiver wire for more crucial pickups. I'm also doing my personal fantasy QB and running back rankings for Week 3 as we look ahead there, because based off of favorable matchups, should you wish to turn to the waiver wire, there might be some guys on my list that could be someone you look at for starting this week. And then last but not least, we go back to Week 1. We talk about a major injury that right now does not seem as serious. Could be a return for an injured player from Week 1 sooner than expected, so I want to update you all on that and the fantasy implications. But before we get into any of it, I do want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network if you so choose. It is greatly appreciated by all. And you guys have been doing a great job of this thing that I'm about to mention. Commenting, super thanks, super chat, and super stickers are always a great way to communicate with me and interact with the show. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, tips, or donations, anything of the like, leave them here for me to address on the show, because I always wish to include your input as well. Without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment of the day concerning that game that happened last night. What a game it was. I mean, if you're a fan of either of these teams, I don't necessarily think you are going to be very encouraged. If you're a Falcons fan, it's a nice little win. But just know that I don't necessarily believe that it was a deserved win. If you're an Eagles fan, you're definitely feeling hard done by right now, because it was right in your hands, literally. And then to have Kirk Cousins, who up to that point didn't necessarily show me enough to say, okay, he's going to lead a game-winning touchdown drive, and to allow him to just march down the field as efficiently as he did should be very concerning as well. But I want to go over the best parts of this game in terms of fantasy stats and things of that nature. So without further ado, let's look into the positives. Kirk Cousins, let's talk about him. As Andre has entered the chat, let's talk about Kirk Cousins a little bit. Up to this point, last night's game is going to change my perspective on Kirk Cousins. I don't necessarily think leading a game-winning drive and creating a sense of optimism around your team wins you brownie points. As Andre also says, what a sigh of relief last night was for me as a Drake London owner. Kudos to you. He did have a nice performance. He wasn't as big as I thought he was going to be. He certainly was not the best Falcons wide receiver, in my opinion, as we'll get to in a little bit. But he did have that game-winning touchdown, and it was a saving grace. Unfortunately, he did not, celebrate it correctly, so to speak, and almost, had the game gone to overtime, would have been to blame for that. But overall, Drake London did have a touchdown. So at the end of the day, you can't be mad there if you're a Drake London owner like Andre. But Kirk Cousins, the thing about Kirk Cousins to me, as Andre says, at least we know he's the number one red zone target now. Well, yeah, that's a sign of something, because they were in the red zone very often in this game, and it's always good to, once you get there, have a contingency plan. But, it's something that we're going to have to monitor as the Falcons begin to cohere a little bit more. But it was a very important win for them, I will say, because had they lost that game, I think they would have been beyond the point of no return. But let's talk about Kirk Cousins, because I feel like we need to. He did have a decent game, though, stats-wise. 20 of 29, 241 yards, 2 TDs, and 17.54 fantasy points. So not the worst game. But if you were watching this game, I don't necessarily think you would say he passed the eye test, at least to me. So just be wary of the fact that while this game was a decent fantasy performance for Kirk, and he could pretend to be a serviceable, at least QB2 if you're in a deeper league or a 2 QB league, and you can flex more options, it doesn't necessarily give me that much hope. I'm still holding my breath waiting to see what this offense looks like against far superior teams. Now, I could say that I was more impressed by the skill players on Atlanta than I was with the ones on Philly, but that's not saying much because Philly was depleted, and Jalen Hurts actually did have a much better game, in my humble opinion, than Kirk Cousins in terms of distributing the ball to them. So, make of this what you will in terms of Kirk Cousins' performance, but it's one that I'm not necessarily moved by if I'm a fantasy football manager. I would have been more moved had, Kirk had done this efficiently throughout, and Philly's defense wasn't, trying to play prevent defense, which was atrocious, by the way. I don't necessarily think they should have. They had the advantage in that situation. They knew Atlanta needed to score a touchdown. Atlanta had all the pressure in that situation, so I don't know why you don't generate pressure in that situation, especially on a guy, a 35-year-old with a torn Achilles, who up to that point didn't prove that he could really harm you. So that's another reason why Kirk, stat-wise, might be as inflated. As Andre said, Mooney shocked me, bro. As I'm going to mention Donald Mooney. Let's go to the Eagles side of things for a little bit, because I do want to give love to what turned out to be not necessarily a disappointing performance in terms of the outcome, but performance that Jalen Hurts had to be hard done by, because I thought he was exceptional last night. Creating out of structure, running the ball in certain situations, understanding situational football. I really don't think that this game was at fault because of him. He did everything he could have done to really try and push this offense on the field. Saquon as well. Saquon impressed me as well, but Jalen Hurts really took the cake as my fantasy star for the Eagles last night. 23 of 30, 183 yards, 1 TD, 1 interception, 1 touchdown on the ground with that tush push there at the end. 23.82 fantasy points. So as you can see, if you look at both QB performances stat-wise, you would say Kirk won the night. But if you actually look what your eyes are showing you, I think that you could say that Jalen Hurts was the more impressive of the two here. Because in that situation, with the absence of A.J. Brown, who could have been the difference in this game had he played, with Britton Covey basically as your wide receiver too, he really stepped up to the plate. I know that a lot of penalties kind of set this offense back, especially along that offensive line. They're going to have to fix and adjust moving forward there. But with what he had, Jalen Hurts really showed out for me and really shocked me as well. Let's get to the Atlanta Falcons as well, because I want to show them some love. Even though their skill position players, had some kind of issues as well, they still played much better, in my humble opinion, than the Philadelphia Eagles skill position players, and that was the difference. Let's talk about one in particular, Bijan Robinson. 14 carries, 97 yards, 16.2 fantasy points. Now, this isn't the kind of performance that would, really say that Bijan is going to be RB3, and the proof is in the pudding with this one. But it is a performance that gives you hope for him in this Raheem Morris offense, because that's what he said. Bijan's going to get a lot of touches in both the running and receiving game, and he did last night. And he made the most of them. He had a couple bad plays, but overall, I liked Bijan last night, and it really gave a sense of optimism for how he fits into this offense schematically. Now, I was also impressed by Tyler Rozier as well, and that gives me pause about what the future of this Falcons offense means for the backfield share there as well. But for now, Bijan's performance really sheds light upon how they can diversify this room if, other skill position players are struggling a little bit. Because at certain times it did feel that way, where, while London had a couple of nice catches and Pitts, kind of got involved, they didn't necessarily move the football down the field. And so having both Bijan and Algier kind of set the tone in early downs really helped them out a lot. So look for this backfield to really be an intriguing one in terms of fantasy implications. Well, let's get to Andre here, because he said that Darnell Mooney shocked me. He shocked me as well, because I really actually kind of liked him coming out of Chicago, and Now that he's on Atlanta, I was kind of skeptical about how he was going to fit into this offense that seemingly felt like it had everything figured out except the quarterback. But last night, you can't say that he wasn't the top receiver in that game, even with Devontae Smith playing in it as well. 3 catches on 7 targets, 88 yards, the 1 touchdown, 17.8 fantasy points. And going forward, he could be a huge asset if, they want to open up the game vertically. And yes, it will all rely on Kirk, trusting his his intermediate to long ball. But at the end of the day, having a guy like Mooney there to catch long touchdown passes like he did last night is really helpful. And it kind of calmed the Falcons' offense down a little bit to have that long play. So Darnell Mooney, I don't necessarily think he will project to be someone you can rely on week in and week out, but he is kind of a nice flex option or a bench option to have to use in certain situations, especially in deeper leagues as well. So look out for Darnell Mooney because this performance was a statement performance from him on a night when skill position talent was the difference here. So what we learned from this game in terms of fantasy, or at least what I learned, is that both of these teams are kind of similar, but also different in how they view their setup. I think that Atlanta took more advantage of every single position player that they had in certain situations, and they were able to do so on that final drive, even though it was mainly about Philadelphia's defense being just appallingly atrocious at that point, rather than, them actually taking advantage of anything. And then on the Eagles side of things, this could be a well-oiled machine. It's just that nothing clicks when not everyone is there, and also the O-line is something to monitor as well. I think that it played better than I thought it would, but they still had a lot of penalties, a lot of mishaps, so we're going to have to look at them in the future as well. But overall, very exciting game. Let me know what you think in the comments about it. But coming up next, we transition from Monday Night Football to the waiver wire. Some interesting guys out there right now on the market, especially for someone who wants to be advantageous like myself and go out and get it and be aggressive in that regard. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about the waiver wire.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. Some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. Before we begin with our second segment, I do want to remind you yet again to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network. It is greatly appreciated by all concerned. Also, they've been doing a fantastic job so far interacting with the show. Continue to do it through Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features on YouTube. Anything is greatly appreciated. I love all the comments that we've been receiving over the past couple of weeks. So, continue doing what you're doing, and this show will be even bigger and better. But without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of the day concerning the waiver wire. Now, the waiver wire is going to be weirder than ever right now because never have I seen the start of the season as Shep Easy's sweet spot comments. Baker's still out there in 2 of my leagues. He's a guy that I myself went out and picked up as well. Very astute observation, because Baker, like I said before on this show, is someone who is going to be in that tier of quarterbacks who you know in the back of your mind has at least 50% of good performances throughout the season within him, and can pretend to actually be someone who you can start week by week. And so Baker is definitely someone who I would definitely pick him on the waiver wire, and did. So fantastic comment from Shep Easy Sweet Spot. But let's talk about some other guys, especially now that so many injuries. And I feel safe, as Tap to Learn says, Sammy D low-hanging fruit. That's another big one as well, because Darnold is also someone who will pretend to be out there as well in my league as well. But there's someone that we haven't mentioned just yet in that kind of tier of QB that I want to start off with, because QB is pretty easy, because there are 3 big names, 2 that Shep Easy Sweet Spot and Tab to Learn alluded to that are out there, but this one, and I promise this isn't my bias coming in, is kind of going under the radar a little bit. So let's start off with Geno Smith. He had 17.88 fantasy points against New England. One of the leading passers, if not the leading passer, I believe, in the league this year. As Tap to Learn says, not Geno. I say that Geno might just be the best out of those options, in my humble opinion, if you really want to know. And it's not by bias. He's throwing the ball better than anybody. Yes, the O-line is a concern, but think about it. He has the weapons at his disposal, more than even Baker could have. He has DK, block him when he's healthy, Jackson Smith and Jigba. Both of them have big games, 100-yard games for that matter, against a defense that a lot of people were very high on after their upset win over Cincinnati. So, Geno should not be underrated anymore. And going into a tougher slate of games, I got the Dolphins. As Sheppy's Sweet Sauce says, Geno's a gem. I agree. They're going up against a Dolphins team that might be a bit slower on offense. Their defense is kind of impressive, but I think that Seattle can take advantage of that situation. Then they have a prime-time game against the Lions, who they always play very tough. Last year, very exciting overtime game. And Geno's always going to be at the center of attention here. He's not even available in any of my leagues, says Sheppy's Sweet Spot. So maybe people are starting to become attuned to them, and I hope that they are. Because Baker and Darnold are fine and dandy. They're fantastic players. But when I think about them, and I think about what Seattle's offense could be once, Grubb's system is fully implemented, most importantly, Geno Smith could be a very dangerous fantasy option on waivers. But let's talk about another position here, wide receiver. Now, one of the notes I had here was the fact that you might have had to bench Justin Jefferson, and maybe you had to pick up someone off waivers, at least for this week, because I don't think the Jefferson injury is as serious as we initially thought. But right now, the wide receiver market is kind of barren. I just looked at it recently before the show. There's not much talent there. So the best thing I could potentially say to you about looking for wide receivers, hidden gems on the waiver wire, is just to follow the injury. Look at teams where star receivers have gone down. For example, not just the Vikings, but the Rams. Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua out for extended periods of time. Tutu Atwell might become another one. Colby Parkinson, the tight end, might get a lot of targets. Even in terms of the running back room, Kyron Williams could get a lot more touches. He has had a slow start, so maybe, even though I don't necessarily like him as a fantasy running back, he can get a lot of targets as well. So it sounds kind of weird to say, but following injuries, as Tap to Learn says, Alec Pierce. Alec Pierce is still out there, but after what I saw out of the Colts this weekend, maybe that was not the best of predictions, because Anthony Richardson did not look up to snuff in the red zone in that game against Green Bay. So we're going to have to tamp down on the Alec Pierce hype a little bit. But there is a name that I want to mention before we end this segment that will really be a shock to your systems if you're all watching. But yeah, the wide receiver and running back markets could become more intriguing as we get more updates on certain injuries, especially for teams that are contending or pretending to contend. And speaking of defenses, actually, because we talked about defenses a lot on the show, how about the Jacksonville Jaguars defense? Now, hear me out. The Jacksonville Jaguars defense is a sneaky pickup for many reasons. They're not the reason that Jacksonville is 0-2. It's all on the offense. The Jacksonville defense has been doing its job. Yes, they haven't faced the best of offenses, but against the Tua-led Miami Dolphins team, they did their job. The Dolphins didn't really have many big plays outside of the Tyreek Hill touchdown catch in that game. And against the Browns, yes, who knows what the Browns are on offense at this point, but they are getting the job consistently done. And against the Bills, it's going to be an interesting game. They might have more pressure on them than ever because the Bills are going to want to grind them down. But if they show that they're the best unit for Jacksonville, then they might be a sneaky addition on the waiver wire if you don't trust any of your other defenses. So while the defensive position isn't as important in fantasy, the Jags D could warrant a nice little pickup as a streaming option, a flex option, or just some defense to keep on your bench in the future. So look out for them. Let's get back to more of a team talk. Let's talk about Malik Willis, because we're going to talk about the situation a little bit more towards the end of the show. But Malik Willis, he's not going to put up big stats, right? And when I looked at his numbers in fantasy, they weren't impressive, really. He only had something around like 12 points. But he did get the job done. He didn't turn the ball over, most importantly. And this week, he's going up against his former team at their place. So look for Malik Willis to not put up eye-popping numbers, but in deeper leagues, he could be someone who you might look at and be like, hey, I could keep him around. Maybe if this injury says as Juwan Jennings or QJ, Quentin Johnson, I believe, says Johnny Pina. That's an interesting question. Because Quentin Johnston's in a situation where he doesn't have any injuries to worry about, you know. He's not immediately portrayed as the wide receiver one in that situation. But they are a run-heavy team. Whereas with Juwan Jennings, he is so vital to that 49ers team, even without all the injuries happening around him. He is someone who can be a reliable target for Brock Purdy and is just as important as, say, a Brandon Ayuk or Deebo Samuel. So I would say Juwan Jennings is an interesting pickup. But kudos to you for bringing up these two names, because these are two names that, when I say follow the injury, should immediately come to mind if you're thinking about what's transpired in terms of the injury crisis around the league. So that's a very astute observation from Johnny Pina. In terms of who I would pick, Juwan Jennings would be the pick. I think that this Quentin Johnston game proved that maybe he did warrant that first-round selection last year, but I'm not swayed by it until you know the Chargers have enough pass attempts where he can put up bigger numbers as well. But him being a nice red zone target could mean something down the road. But Juwan Jennings right now is in a more competent offense, has known the system for longer, and actually has been someone that can be relied upon for San Fran. So Juwan Jennings is my pick. Let's get back to Malik Willis, because in terms of Malik Willis as well, and Packers wide receivers too, that's kind of something you have to monitor as well, because I'm going to talk about the Love injury later in the show. As Splashbo said, how long is Deebo out? Well, they did say that he was expected to miss, as Johnny Pina says, thanks for the input. Always, my man. I love that you are commenting as well. I believe you're a new person commenting, so thank you for your input as well. Going back to the Deebo question, I do believe they said he was going to be out for a couple of weeks. Didn't necessarily expand on that, but I would assume that they put him on the IR. It's going to be complicated because McCaffrey is already there, but we're going to have to see this situation pan out, because if, say, McCaffrey and Samuel project to be out for similar amounts of time, that could be very detrimental to this offense. So it's interesting. As Splashball says, dang, it's my boy. Well, I think that you would have to go to the waiver wires there. But before I end this segment, I do want to give you guys a wacky, out there waiver wire option. Someone who you may not even consider. And this is just a name that I thought might interest people. How about, and I know this will sound very crazy, Andre Yoshivas. Let's give love to this young man out of Princeton, mind you. In that game against Kansas City, 2 catches only, I believe on only 5 targets for 7 yards. But both of those catches were red zone touchdowns. Now, yes, you can say, well, I think that this whole wide receiver situation in Cincy will finally pan out. But you gotta believe that if it doesn't, Andre Yoshivas will have a bigger role in the Cincy offense. And it's nice to know they have a red zone threat outside of just Jamar Chase, because there is still a cloud hanging over the Bengals' heads, I believe. I still think there's tension there. But if they can get, a wide receiver 3 in there as a contingency plan, and he can prove that he can have a long-term future on the team, I'm all for it. You might not want to go for him on the waiver wire, but just know that he could be someone who sneaks up on you. But let me know what you think in the comments. You've been doing a great job. But coming next, I give you my personal thoughts on the rankings based off of favorable matchups for Week 3 for all the QBs in the league. A lot of guys that we've already mentioned, and a lot of guys that pretend to have big games or I'm really holding out hope for. So you don't want to miss it. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And this next segment is back from popular demand. I'm going to be doing my own personal fantasy QB rankings for this week. Actually, they're not necessarily rankings. I just look at the QB matchups for the week and kind of decipher who I believe will have standout performances, but they are kind of rankings because I think that you can definitely figure out who I favor over others based off the matchup as well. And it's something that you kind of have to do in fantasy terms. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with a guy that's already been mentioned on today's show. Someone who I'm kind of shocked was still out there on waivers, deserves to be at the very least a high-end QB2 in some leagues at this moment in time. Baker Mayfield going up against the Broncos. 18.8 fantasy points against Detroit in that revenge game really showed the moxie and awareness that he's now becoming a part of his game now that he's on Tampa. Now, a lot of people were concerned, and a lot of people might still be concerned, that this whole Liam Cohen thing might not work out because he was so exceptional under Dave Canales and his rejuvenation last year. But this year just feels different because even though it's a different face at OC, it's still the same kind of concept. But now that Baker is more smart and astute and knows his players that he has in the system and has a deeper connection with them, especially Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, it's kind of allowed him to be one of the more mature QBs in the league. Going up against a Broncos team that kind of feels all helter-skelter, I think that their defense is still very excellent. They have a fantastic secondary that will keep them in games. But right now, this Broncos team does not seem very appealing to me at all, even if their defense is their best part of this game. And Baker will take advantage of that. He is hungry. He's ready to take the league by storm this year. And he just looks much more mature. Yes, there were a couple of plays in that Lions game where you might say he looked a little bit like the shaky Cleveland Baker that we saw early on in his career. But for the most part, he has been a solid citizen at the QB position. And that is why I myself personally picked him up off waivers. I said, he can't be out on the market for that longer. I've got to take precedent here and pick him up myself. So make sure that Baker, if he's still out there on waivers, is claimed by you or by someone else because he deserves to be. Let's talk about an interesting QB kind of matchup here between two QBs that have taken the league by storm thus far. Jared Goff and Kyler Murray. Lions against Cardinals. This game has now become one of the weirder, kind of contentious matchups in Week 3 because of the play of both of these teams. On one side, you have Jared Goff, who kind of had a career year last year, a lot of expectations, a lot of hype surrounding him in this offense this year, but they've kind of fallen flat this year. I wasn't impressed by their win against LA, and I was left a little bit kind of, not necessarily stunned, but kind of felt a little bit sad for them after losing to the Bucs, where there was a lot of hype around this game, and I wanted to see both of these QBs go toe-to-toe, and Jared Goff did not live up to expectations for some reason. He does not look like the same guy as he did last year. The offense isn't operating the same as it was last year, but he still put up good yards, just that he's not necessarily putting up the fantasy points you would want him to. But then again, he's never necessarily been that attractive of a fantasy QB. He's kind of in that, not necessarily putting him on that pedestal in QB terms, but he's kind of like an Aaron Rodgers if you look at him from just a pure fantasy perspective, where he puts up good stats, but he's not necessarily the best fantasy QB. But now it's starting to become that he's not a good fantasy QB and not good in producing in real life. But this game just feels different. Yes, the Cardinals' defense looked stellar against the Rams, but they were a banged-up Rams team. Down 2 O-linemen, down 2 of your top receivers. Of course, any defense is going to look good against a depleted offense. So, Jared Goff should take advantage of this Cardinals defense because they're not as good as what they looked like against the LA Rams. They're not going to play depleted teams week in, week out. And so this game definitely could project to be a shootout. On the other side of things, Kyler has looked nothing short of amazing. Perfect passer rating this past weekend. 28.54 fantasy points against the Rams. Really looks very comfortable to start the year. He was a guy that I was singing his praises before the season even started. I knew that he just fits this offense so well, and once he came back, even though Jonathan Gannon had not necessarily seen him as Tim Nelson, a new commenter says, I got Laporta and Bowers. Worth flexing one of my other options are Xavier Worthy, Tank Dell, and Yoshivas. I would say you can flex because of the guys that you mentioned as other options. Xavier Worthy, I really like. Definitely didn't have the best of games against the Bengals this weekend, but I still project him to have a lot of targets. I still project him to get a lot of touches in this offense. They're going to find ways to scheme him into this, and especially now with the absence of Hollywood Brown, he is going to have to play a bigger role. And Tank Dell, I really like him. In that game against the Bears, really didn't have many big plays, but still, I think that, he is what a wide receiver 3 is supposed to be. And Yoshivas, who knows what he's going to be. I just mentioned him as someone who could be a red zone threat for the Cincy Bengals team, but he's more of a long-term project, but they're still nice options. Laporta and Bowers, though, I expect Laporta to get going, and Bowers had a good game against the Ravens this past weekend, so they're 2 nice options, but you can't afford to flex one of them. I feel like Bowers is right now still an experiment, and I don't expect him to be a week in, week out, or a tight end that can consistently put up those numbers, and they're not necessarily going to be a pass-first offense. So I feel like it's worth it to flex one of them and maybe, bring in a guy like Xavier Worthy, because Xavier Worthy is going to have a lot of touches. So, fantastic question. Thank you for commenting, Tim Nelson. But let's get back to all of our fantasy QBs that we want to talk about here. Because Kyler is definitely going to perform in this game. I feel it. I feel that this Cardinals offense is getting better than we expected. I really was impressed by McBride as well. Wilson is becoming more and more of a fascinating option. So look for this to be a competitive game. And then let's talk about Joe Burrow a little bit. This is a game, Monday night game against the Commanders, so he has a little bit of rest. I don't necessarily think that, Joe Burrow has played that badly, but he certainly feels like he needs a game where he can just get warmed up, and this is a perfect example of that game. It's a Washington Commanders defense that really hasn't been up to snuff. Yes, they beat the Giants, held them to only one touchdown, but it is what it is. Against the Chiefs, he played exceptionally well, albeit had that bad fumble at the end of the game that proved to be the quote-unquote game-winning touchdown. But at the end of the day, he did pretty well, considering the circumstances surrounding him. He just needs a game against a team that is an easy win to get him going, and I believe that the Bengals should be fine. I'm not panicking just yet about the Cincinnati Bengals and their season. So, Joe Burrow against the Commanders, pretty much a lock, if you want my opinion, in terms of starting him as your QB1 this weekend. But then, let's talk about this guy again, because if he plays, it's a very intriguing matchup. Going back to the team that drafted him, going back to their home stadium, Malik Willis. I think that it's a niche pick. In deeper leagues, it could make sense. But overall, Malik Willis is definitely in a better situation than most QBs will be in if they have to come in to replace their QB1. So, Malik Willis did a good job with what he did. He didn't do that much, wasn't expected to do that much. Just stayed on schedule, got his first career NFL touchdown, if you can believe it. And I think that as long as he stays ahead of schedule, he could spring a surprise on Tennessee. He knows this team very well. Yes, they have a new coaching staff, and they have a good team outside of Will Levis's mistakes, and they could themselves have a positive record, maybe be even sitting 2-0 right now if Will Levis hadn't made the mistakes. But at the end of the day, Matt LaFleur has proven that he can do a good job with either Jordan Love or Willis in the game. His game plan is not changed. His game script does not change. And so look for Malik Willis to still stay ahead of schedule here in this game. But overall, all these fantasy QBs can be interesting plays. But some of them, it must be noted that in deeper leagues, maybe they're better. Some of these I will start straight up. Some of these you might have to wait and see. But right now, I feel that all of these guys can, to some effect, get going in this league. Let me know what you think in the comments. Another guy that I will throw out there, how about Skylar Thompson? I wouldn't be surprised, even as a Seahawks fan, and I don't want it to happen. Skylar Thompson having all these weapons at his disposal, just dinking and dunking his way on the field, maybe putting up a couple touchdowns. Who knows? But at the end of the day, these guys all project to really stand out this weekend because of the favorable matchups that they have. So, make of that what you will. But coming up next on today's show, we are going to be looking at the running backs now. Especially now that a lot of different storylines are coming out about injuries, you want to stay ahead of the curve in terms of picking your running back for Week 3. So we'll be right back after this short break to talk about that and more.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are transitioning from the QB position in terms of my personal rankings to the running back position. Now, like I said before the break, the running back market is going to be very weird and wacky over these next couple of weeks. A lot of injuries at the position. A lot of guys who I had already put on this list before Week 2's games even started that I thought would have big games in Week 3. But it's now kind of a weird market to look at. And it's going to show in some of these rankings as well. So without further ado, let's look at some players who could step up and assume the role of RB1 for you on your fantasy teams this week. Let's start off with a guy playing on Thursday night. A lot to prove, a lot of weight on his shoulders in this New England Patriots offense, and that is Ramondre Stevenson. Really one of the more impressive running backs these past couple of weeks for New England. A lot of weight, though, is falling on his shoulders. So in a later segment in the week, I'm going to talk about how Ramondre Stevenson could have a point to prove. But for now, he has been one of the best running backs in terms of fantasy. He gets a lot of yards on the ground. He's not the best receiving, but they don't necessarily need him to receive if he's doing so well on the ground. And that's a huge part of what the Patriots' identity is. So that really helps in regards to, the amount of touches he's going to get. That being said, you're going to have to monitor his health a lot more. Because, with a heavy workload and things of that nature, you don't want what happened to, say, Joe Mixon, who kind of projected to have a heavier workload than people expected in Houston, to happen to a guy like Ramondre Stevenson just because of the amount of touches he's getting and the amount of work he's putting in to help that offense. So it's going to be a very interesting matchup. I think that there's a lot to be said about the Jets' run defense. It hasn't been the best up to this point, so the Patriots feel like they can exploit that, but in different matchups week by week, Ramondre Stevenson will have a lot more weight on his shoulders due to the fact that I don't think he can expect to carry this out for 17 so games. But for now, I'm confident in saying that Ramondre Stevenson will continue to have decent games for you. And this is another guy who's up in the air a little bit, but I wanted to give credit to Kenneth Walker because we saw it Sunday against the Patriots where the offense looked night and day from what it was in that second half against Denver to what it was throughout the entirety of the game against New England. When Kenneth Walker is in that Seattle running game system, he is much better than what they had with Zach Charbonnet. And it's not an indictment of Zach Charbonnet because he's good for what he is. He's a third down back, blocking back, can pick up little 3rd and 1 situational football plays. But Kenneth Walker just makes this offense tick when he's on the field. He keeps them ahead of schedule. And he takes a lot of pressure, most importantly, off Geno Smith, opens up the offense more for Geno Smith as well. So you're kind of looking at that stack. That's a pretty decent stack if he's healthy. And against a Dolphins team that kind of feels a little bit down and out heading into Week 3 because of the whole situation surrounding Tua, they can try and take advantage of it. It will all depend on his health because he was out against New England, I believe, with a calf injury. So we're going to have to see how that plays out throughout the week. But I'm not necessarily concerned about Kenneth Walker as a fantasy running back because of this injury. It's not as significant as I believe people are saying. So he's going to be someone who is always there and thereabouts for you in terms of fantasy. And then another guy who I want to kind of see get going a little bit, could get going in this game against the Giants this coming week, Jerome Ford. I think that a lot of people are shocked that Jerome Ford is either A, not getting enough touches in the Browns offense, and B, not doing the most with the touches that he does get in the Browns offense, because he's projecting to be one of the best players right now for the Browns. And I think that if the Browns are true in their sentiment that they don't want to rush Nick Chubb back and they're going to hold him out for as long as possible, Jerome Ford is going to have to step up. He did have a decent game, 17 carries, 64 yards, 7.4 points against Jacksonville. But right now, when I'm looking at the game that they have right now against the Giants, this is a game where Jerome Ford can get right. This is a game where I feel confident that we can finally see the Jerome Ford we expected come to fruition. And when I think about, the ineptitudes of this Browns offense, I don't think they've ever had the advantage of having a guy like Jerome Ford, and that's kind of muddying what Kevin Stefanski might want to do as opposed to what he can do. Because Nick Chubb and Jerome Ford, if you think about it, are two very different backs. Nick Chubb right now is more of a power workhorse back who can, in certain situations, have the big explosive play. Jerome Ford, in my humble opinion, is an explosive play back. His bread and butter is going to come from the explosive play. So it kind of, messes with the whole offensive structure now that, you have a guy like that instead of a guy like Nick Chubb who just keeps you on schedule. So I can understand the frustrations of the Cleveland Browns offense, but at the same time, Jerome Ford still needs to project to get more than what he's giving us right now. So this is all going to depend on how the whole Nick Chubb situation pans out, and most importantly, how Kevin Stefanski is going to use him in the system. But as of right now, I still think that he's going to project to be someone I really like going forward in fantasy for as long as Nick Chubb is out. Then another guy who I'm kind of mad that I projected him, Isaiah Pacheco, fractured fibula, out 6 weeks. But looking at that Chiefs squad in terms of what this run game could look like, they have been in talks with Kareem Hunt, bringing him back. But Carson Steele could be a guy, very interesting kind of player, where he's more of a fullback, H-back hybrid, where he comes in situations where it's 3rd and short, maybe on early downs to get you a bit of chunk yardage there. But at the end of the day, I think that if you're the Chiefs, your run game is still very integral to you, because of the fact that now you know the whole situation with your wide receivers and how you want to develop them as the year goes on. You can focus on getting a guy like Carson Steele up to speed in this system. I still believe they also have, if I remember correctly, they still have Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Let me know in the comments if they do not anymore, because I wasn't aware of them if they had traded him away or they released him or so. But at this current moment, it's kind of maddening that a guy like Isaiah Pacheco, who's so valuable in terms of fantasy assets, is injured and out for a certain period of time. And also on a team where he projects to be someone who can keep them ahead of schedule and can find places to have big games in fantasy perspectives. So in terms of that whole injury, it's going to be a weird one to monitor. I don't necessarily like Steele. Maybe you can find someone out there where they're kind of similar profile to Isaiah Pacheco, but you can't find many of them where they're on a world-beating team and they just are the workhorse back who can, when necessary, make the explosive play for you. But then let's talk about some flex options, so to speak, for the running back position. And these two guys kind of are disappointing at this point in time. These are two guys who I expected more out of as the season started, and they really haven't lived up to par as of right now. Kyren Williams and Travis Etienne. Kyren, I believe, had 13.52 fantasy points. Etienne only 4.8 this past week. And it just goes to show that, when you're in two very different offenses, one of your Kyren Williams where you can have big plays, but you're kind of tertiary to what's going on in the overall scheme. And then Travis Etienne, where he does play a big role, is seen as someone who can really help Trevor Lawrence stay on schedule in the backfield in this offense. It really goes to show that when things go awry, your play is affected as well, especially if you're Kyren Williams, who really had very high hopes coming into this year. I did warn people about him as well, though, because I said I want to see him do this over a larger sample size, so didn't say I'm going to warn you, but it is kind of maddening right now to consider the fact that, yes, while he now could project to get some of the most touches on this LA Rams team because of all the injuries, he didn't do much even when this was a fully healthy team in the first 2 games. And then with Travis Etienne, I just think it's kind of a offense structural issue. I think that there's more than one problem to fix and adjust on the Jacksonville Jaguars offensive front of things. And it's not necessarily Travis Etienne's job to, always keep this team on schedule. Yes, you can look to the fumble in week 1 where it's kind of a situational moment that you look back on and say, well, you have to make that play. You have to protect the ball. But right now, the disappointing thing about Jacksonville extends far beyond what Travis Etienne is. And these 2 guys right now, they have opportunities. They're in very opportunistic systems that can rely upon them at certain times. By the end of the day, the pressure now on them is really probably going to matter a lot as well, because Jacksonville does not look good at all on offense to start the season, and right now the Rams are a bit of a dumpster fire in terms of all the injuries they have to deal with. So both of those guys are in complicated situations, but they can have prove-it moments. I'm not putting it past them to really grow into the season, but it's all going to depend on how these offenses project. But overall, all of these fantasy running backs have a point to prove, and when they're healthy, they can be the best of the best at the position. They can help you in many different ways if you're a fantasy football manager. All of them have fantastic traits that you really want to see out of fantasy football running backs, but at the end of the day, health is going to be a major concern with this position group going forward. But that will just about do it for this segment here. Let me know what you think in the comments. Our final segment of the day is going to concern an injury sustained in week 1. We're going to be looking back at what happened with Jordan Love, his new timeline to return, and also the fantasy implications should the situation get a little bit messier. So we'll be right back to finish the show after the break with that particular segment. Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. For our final segment of today's show, we are going to be looking back at a significant injury that occurred in week 1 but still has fantasy implications and fallout happening as we progress into week 3. However, there is a kind of good news around this situation if you are a Green Bay Packers fan. Hint as to what this injury is that has surfaced concerning what happened with Jordan Love. So without further ado, let us jump right into this segment because I think it's an interesting one. We didn't have much time last week to dwell on this injury, so I want to give you a little bit of an update on it now that we are in week 3. So, as we all know, suffered a leg injury, Jordan Love did in week 1. Want to kind of point out that it's through no fault of his own. That field should not have been played on. They had to do better, Brazil, in getting that field better, but it is what it is. But the big news concerning Jordan Love and his status is the fact that he could return week 4, which is their first divisional game, ironically, against the Minnesota Vikings, who right now, sitting at 2-0, sit atop the division. So, if Jordan Love is able to return in Week 4, that is a huge game in terms of not just getting him back to full speed, but also to get back into the division, and also in terms of potentially seeding in the future if both of these teams potentially end up as wild card competitors. Now, the reason why I think a lot of people might have glossed over the Jordan Love injury is because it happened so early, and it's because the Packers kind of projected to have a lighter schedule than most. They didn't necessarily have to worry too much about any kind of major injuries early in the season. It was sucky to lose to the Eagles in Brazil, but it was kind of a weird game in that regard. They did get that win against the Colts, which is very big for them going forward, and they play the Titans, which leads me to the irony of Malik Willis being their backup quarterback and the fantasy implications that he presents as well. So, the thing about Malik Willis was, like I said when we were mentioning him about the waiver wire, right? He was someone who stayed ahead of schedule in this game, didn't turn the ball over, most importantly, which is all you can ask of a backup quarterback. He has 12 for 14 passing, 122 passing yards, 12.88 fantasy points. If you are potentially looking at him for this game, I don't know. If you're in a deep league, you could be. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is, if he has to play that game against the Vikings, what is this team going to look like fantasy-wise as well? Because if he plays against the Titans, I think that game could be about the most even we'll see this week, because he kind of knows the system. The Titans, yes, it's a new kind of coaching regime, but he kind of knows the system. And Matt LaFleur seems to have gotten the best out of him, seems to know what he's comfortable with, seems to have a game script for him, almost exactly set out to utilize the best of what he can be. And if it's, just managing the game, being safe, playing safe football, then that's what it is. But it does leave questions surrounding the receiving core, which is always going to be the big question, especially about a loaded receiving core much like the Green Bay Packers, where you don't necessarily have a wide receiver one that you can point to and say, I'm always going to start you in fantasy. Now, the thing about this week's game against the Titans is that there are a lot of ways that you can take advantage of the Titans through the air. I think that, Josh Jacobs owners will be pretty happy that he had over 150 yards in that game. But at the end of the day, let Malik Willis have freedom, at the very least. I think that you might be shocked if Malik Willis gets a little loose, because he has a lot of good traits to be a good passing QB. He's not just someone who can just sit back there and manage a game. He's someone who I believe can actually take over a game if need be. He just was not in the best of situations in Tennessee. They were really up in the air with their QB situation once he was there. So, Malik Willis, it potentially could be his last game, so who knows? If you want to take a swing on any of the Packers players on the offensive side of the ball, be my guest, because this game could go many different ways for this Packers offense. Either it's going to be Josh Jacobs grounding it out on the ground, or Malik Willis could be allowed to have freedom because it potentially be his last game. But let's get ahead of the fact here. Let's look ahead to the future, the long-term future, and talk about when Love could return and what it could mean for this team. The best case scenario, of course, is that he returns in Week 4, much like people are starting to think, to play against the Vikings. Now, I don't necessarily think that the Vikings game will hold as much weight as people think. So, if he does come back for that game, it could portend to be risky, but it's also kind of a little bit premature to think that you have to force him back, because the schedule, like I said, was very advantageous. They got the Colts and the Titans. So If, say, you're 2-1 heading into that game against the Vikings, and you feel like Jordan Love could start that game, but you don't want to risk it, then why just not play him? Because while you definitely want to get a divisional win on the board, I completely understand that. It's still early in the season. If Malik Willis wins that game against the Titans, you're 2-2 at the worst if you lose that game to Minnesota. And Jordan Love could sit out longer, get back to full health, and be ready for the stretch run. So you have to pick your poison here, I think. It's obviously, if you're a fantasy football manager and you have a number of Packers players on your team, the best thing we would want for them is for Jordan Love to be out because he gives them the best opportunity to get good fantasy stats. But the fact of the matter is, you can afford to, if you're the Packers, have Malik Willis out there and run more game managers games, then, risk potentially having Jordan Love not play to the best of his abilities, coming back prematurely from injury. So, the Packers have now become a long-term team, looking ahead to the long term of the season. Now, the reason why the hope and optimism surrounding the timeline can be positive for Jordan Love is because of the fact that there's a lot of questions about the Packers receiving room now. So, the question should be, is it going to be a positive effect for all these players should, the Packers organization want to keep out Love for the stretch run? And the question also is, if Malik Willis is asked to do more in this offense, asked to play more in this offense, what's the best way for him to get comfortable to where when we kind of have to worry about winning games, he could potentially, lead us to more victories. And so, the reason why I'm not, completely out on the Packers receivers is that there could be many different ways that this plays out. There could be Malik Willis, having to play a couple more games than expected, and Matt LaFleur eventually, having to let loose, having to open up the playbook a bit more. Or you can bring back Love prematurely, and suddenly the stock that was there with the Packers wide receiver room skyrockets. But it's all kind of a crapshoot when you're this early in the season and you're already thinking about the long term for yourself as a team. But right now, if I'm the Green Bay Packers, I'm kind of waiting it out, so to speak. I'm kind of projecting the chunks of the season where games will become more important and setting up for those. I don't think at this juncture you're concerned about one divisional game where you might have to start your backup. I think you are looking ahead at certain games where you feel, whether it's Malik Willis or Jordan Love, you can either maintain your structure with Malik Willis that you've built up, or go to Jordan Love and bring him back. So it's going to be interesting to see if, the shortened timeline surrounding Love does plan out, and he does project to play Week 4, how the Packers handle it. Because while Malik Willis doesn't offer a lot of fantasy upside in terms of what he brings to the Packers offense, he is still serviceable, and I think that Matt LaFleur knows what he has in him now. He knows at the very least he can win you games. Most importantly, he's someone who doesn't necessarily have much pressure on him because of how early this injury came. So it's going to be a very interesting situation, especially considering the fact that I don't think Jordan Love needs to rush into this or rush back for the Vikings game. But at the end of the day, it's all about fantasy implications, right? Because you know what the Packers can be without Jordan Love, and you know what they are with him. But let me know what you'll think in the comments. But that will just about do it for this show. Thank you all for tuning in. I've been Chris Shepard. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Continue to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. Also, continue doing a fantastic job of leaving tips, donations, questions, comments, and concerns. The Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features on YouTube. You all have been fantastic today. Tune in tomorrow, same time as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, for another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Thank you all. Shepard out.